Marcus Johnson stood tall in his meticulously tailored navy suit, his shiny black leather shoes reflecting the cold, fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The smell of old oak from the rows of benches blends with the smell of leather and the solemn atmosphere typical of the Harris County District Court, Houston. The hammer rang loudly, a familiar sound he had heard hundreds of times in his career as a federal prosecutor. But today, he is not standing in his usual position next to the prosecutor's chair. "Defendant Marcus Johnson," Judge William Henderson said in a high-pitched voice, the deep wrinkles on his aged face moving with each word. "You are charged with running a red light and endangering pedestrians. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel the judging eyes from behind, the court attendees, the court clerks, and especially Judge Henderson's undisguised look of contempt. 10 years in the profession have taught him how to read eyes like that. "Your Honor," Marcus spoke up, his voice low and professional, "I plead not guilty." A sneer rang out from the judge. "Of course," Henderson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You guys are always like that." Marcus felt his blood boil. Guys, that word was like a needle pricking his skin. During his 35 years of life, he has become accustomed to such implicitly racist words. But what really upset him was not Henderson's attitude, but the fact that those words came from a person tasked with administering justice. "Sir," Marcus said, trying to stay calm, "I have dashcam video evidence that the light was still yellow when I went through the intersection." "Ah, is that so?" Henderson raised an eyebrow. "And I should trust the word of a—" He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning Marcus's dark skin. "Someone like you more than the police report?" The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Marcus could hear the whirring of the ceiling fan above his head, the rustling of papers, and the rapid beating of his own heart. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead, but it wasn't from fear. It was suppressed anger, a familiar feeling that he had learned to control over years of facing prejudice and discrimination. "Judge Henderson," Marcus said slowly, each word clear and weighted, "I understand that you have the right to evaluate the credibility of the evidence, but I think you should review this video before presenting it. Decision." Henderson waved it off. "It's not necessary. I've seen enough cases like this. Fine of $500 and license suspension for 30 days. Marcus clenched his fists. He could feel his nails digging into his palms, but the pain couldn't compare to the emotional pain and anger that was rising. Throughout his career, he fought tirelessly to uphold justice, to prove that the legal system could be fair and unbiased. And now, he himself became a victim of the injustice he tried to fight against. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice no longer as calm as before, "I would like to file an appeal." "Suit yourself," Henderson smirked, "but I advise you to accept this fine. Sometimes," he insisted, "a little more reasonableness is better." Marcus slowly opened his leather briefcase and took out a business card. The sound of paper rubbing against leather echoed in the silence of the courtroom. He stepped forward and placed the business card on the judge's desk. "I am Marcus Johnson, federal attorney with the United States Attorney's Office, Southern District of Texas," he said, his voice low and clear. "And I think we need to discuss how you're running this trial." The blood drained from Henderson's face. He picked up the business card, his hands shaking slightly. The courtroom suddenly became lively with whispers. Marcus could hear Henderson gasping for breath, see small beads of sweat beginning to appear on his forehead. I don't know," Henderson stammered. "Yes, you don't know," Marcus said, his voice calm but powerful. "You don't know who I am. You just see the color of my skin, and make assumptions. That's not how justice works, Your Honor. The smell of Henderson's nervous sweat mixed with the smell of old wood in the air. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to be the only sound that broke the tense atmosphere. Marcus could sense the change in the air, from contempt to apprehension, from power to fear. "I will request an investigation into your previous trials," Marcus continued, "about how you treated black defendants, about the prejudices that influenced your judgment. Because this isn't just about me. This is about everyone who has stood in my position before here. People who are incapable of defending themselves against injustice." Henderson swallowed hard, his throat moving awkwardly. He put down the business card, his hands still shaking. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. Maybe we should reconsider this case." "No, sir," Marcus shook his head. "We need to reconsider more than that. We need to reconsider the entire way he dispenses justice." The whispers in the courtroom grew louder and louder, like small waves gradually rising into a tide. Marcus could feel the energy in the room changing, from initial contempt to surprise, then to curiosity, and even awe. But that did not satisfy him. Respect should not come from position or power. It should come from recognizing the inherent dignity of people. Judge Henderson still sat stiffly in his chair, his face as pale as paper. The sweat on his forehead had soaked his white collar. In the tense atmosphere, the ceiling fan still rotated steadily, creating a monotonous sound as if counting the passing seconds. "Mr. Johnson," Henderson finally said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean—" "No idea, sir?" Marcus interrupted, his voice low but sharp as a knife. "Didn't mean to judge me based on the color of my skin? Didn't mean to ignore my right to a fair trial? Or didn't mean to let your prejudices affect justice?" Each question was like an arrow, piercing the old judge's conscience. Marcus could see Henderson cringe with each sentence. The smell of fear, a strong, sour smell typical of nervous sweat, emanated from Henderson like a silent confession. "I've worked in the justice system long enough to understand that justice is not always blind," Marcus continued, taking slow steps toward the judge's table. The sound of his leather shoes tapping on the wooden floor echoed in the silence of the courtroom. "But what hurts me isn't the bias. It's that it comes from the very people tasked with upholding justice." From the back row, an older black woman whispered, "Amen," a small but emotional whisper. Marcus didn't look back, but he could feel sympathy and support from those witnessing this moment. Henderson wiped the sweat from his forehead with a soaked handkerchief. The smell of disinfectant alcohol from the handkerchief mixed with the scent of nervous sweat, creating an unpleasant mixture. "Mr. Johnson, perhaps we should discuss this in my office." "No, sir," Marcus shook his head. "What needs to be said has to be said here, in front of everyone. Because this isn't just about you and me. This is about a much bigger issue." He turned around, facing the crowd in the courtroom. Faces of all skin colors and ages were looking at him intently. In their eyes, he saw concern, hope, and pain, the pain of people who were too familiar with injustice. "Every day," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the quiet space, "hundreds of people enter this courtroom. They come here hoping to be treated fairly, to be judged based on their actions, not the color of their skin or their background, but instead, they face stereotypes, assumptions, and biased judgments." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in to each person in the room. The hum of the air conditioner served as a sad chorus to his speech. "I stand here today not as a federal prosecutor," Marcus continued, "but as a citizen who believes that justice must truly be colorblind. And when those who receive entrusted with the task of enforcing justice is the one who breaks this principle, we have a responsibility to speak up. Henderson was completely silent, his face no longer filled with contempt or authority, but instead with unconcealed shame. The wrinkles on his face seemed deeper and older under the courtroom lights. "Judge Henderson," Marcus turned around to face the judge. "I'm not asking you to resign. I'm not asking you to give up your position. What I'm asking is for you to reconsider the way you do things. Do justice. Remember that every person standing before you, no matter who they are, what color they are, where they come from, deserves to be treated with the same respect and fairness." The room fell silent after Marcus's words. No one coughed. No one whispered. It seemed no one even dared to breathe loudly. There was only the sound of the clock on the wall ticking steadily, counting the seconds of this historic moment. Henderson finally raised his head, his old eyes red. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I'm sorry. Not just for the way I treated you today, but for all the times I let my prejudices get the best of me. To the verdict. He paused, swallowing hard. "I promise to do better." Marcus nodded slightly, not because he was satisfied with the apology, but because he realized this could be the first step of a change. "Thank you, Judge Henderson. But I hope you understand that the investigation will proceed. Not out of hatred or revenge, but because we need to ensure that true justice is served in this courtroom." In the following days, the story of the confrontation between Marcus Johnson and Judge Henderson spread through the Houston legal community like wildfire. Every time Marcus entered the courthouse, he could feel the eyes following him, some admiring, some curious, and still others unsympathetic. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor, each step a reminder of the responsibility he was carrying. In his office at the federal court, Marcus sits in front of a thick stack of files, cases that Henderson has tried over the past 3 years. The smell of old paper and ink mixed with the bitter scent of coffee from the cooling cup on the table. Through the window, the Houston afternoon sunlight shines down on the pages, painting the numbers and data a haunting pale yellow color. 72% of black defendants receive sentences higher than average, Marcus muttered, his fingers running over the statistics. 85% of appeals from people of color are dismissed without full consideration. Each number is like a knife cutting into the conscience of the justice system that he has devotedly served. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Chen, an Asian American co-worker, walked in with a serious look on her face. The gentle scent of her perfume mixed with the tense atmosphere in the room. "Marcus," she said, her voice low, "Henderson has applied for early retirement." Marcus raised his head, his tired eyes narrowed. "When?" "This morning, immediately after the preliminary report on the investigation was submitted." Marcus sighed, turned around in his leather chair, and looked out the window. The sunset is dyeing Houston's skyscrapers red, like giant torches burning in the sky. "This is not what I want, Sarah." "But it was necessary," Sarah replied, moving to stand by the window. "I know that." In the next moment of silence, Marcus could hear the hum of traffic from the street below, the hum of the air conditioner, and the beating of his own heart. Every beat is like a question. Did he do it right? Will this create real change? "I received a letter," Marcus finally spoke, "from a black woman who was sentenced by Henderson 3 years ago. She wrote that when she saw me standing up in the courtroom that day, she cried. Not because of joy or gloating, but because at last there are also people who say what she cannot say. Sarah sat down in the chair across from Marcus's desk. The office lights reflected deep sadness in her dark eyes. "That's why we do this, Marcus. Not for one person, but for everyone who has no voice." Marcus nodded, turning back to the stack of files in front of him. "But sometimes I wonder, will getting rid of one Henderson really change the system? Or will there be another Henderson in his place, with more hidden, more subtle prejudices?" "Change doesn't come in a day," Sarah said softly. "It comes from small actions, courageous decisions, and people who dare to stand up and say no to injustice." At that moment, Marcus's phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number. "I am Judge Henderson's daughter. My father wants to meet you." Marcus looked at the phone screen, feeling his fingers tremble slightly. He could refuse this meeting, ending everything with Henderson's departure. But part of him knew that this wasn't the ending he wanted. "I'll go see him," Marcus said, rising from his chair. Sarah looked at him with concern. "Are you sure? No one asked you to do this." "That's right," Marcus nodded, putting on his vest. "No one asked. But sometimes, the hardest conversations are the most necessary." On the drive to Henderson's house, Marcus turned on the radio. Nina Simone's voice rang out in the car space. "I wish I knew how it would feel to be free." The sad melody mixed with the sound of small rain starting to fall on the car windshield, creating a song of mixed hope and pain. The neighborhood where Henderson lives is a quiet neighborhood, typical of middle-class Houston. Two-story houses with manicured lawns, expensive cars parked in garages, and an air of security and stability that money and privilege bring. Marcus parked in front of a colonial-style house with white pillars and tall windows. The rain was still falling lightly, creating a thin mist between him and the house. As Marcus walked up the steps, the scent of rain-drenched magnolia flowers wafted through the air. The doorbell rang through the house, and after a tense moment of waiting, the door opened. William Henderson stood there, no longer in his usual judge's robes, but in an old sweater and wrinkled khaki pants. He looked 10 years older than the last time Marcus saw him in the courtroom. "Mr. Johnson," Henderson spoke, his voice hoarse as if he had just woken up from a long sleep. "Thank you for coming." Marcus nodded slightly, entering the house as Henderson stepped back to make way. The smell of pine and Earl Grey tea wafted from the living room, a warm and familiar scent of American family homes. The walls are filled with family photos, a younger Henderson, smiling with his wife and daughter on graduations, birthdays, and vacations. "Sorry for the mess," Henderson said as he led Marcus into his office. It was a small room with bookshelves reaching to the ceiling, the smell of leather from old law books, and the smell of yellowed paper creating a familiar space for both men. "Rebecca, my daughter, usually helps me clean this place, but these days I don't let her bother me anymore." Marcus sat down in the armchair across from the desk, observing the man in front of him. Henderson looked like a statue worn by time. His wrinkles were deeper, his shoulders were sagging, and in his old eyes was an undisguised fatigue. "I've read the preliminary investigation report," Henderson said, pouring tea into 2 old porcelain cups. The sound of flowing tea creates a gentle sound in the silent space. It made me think a lot." "About what, sir?" Marcus asked, accepting the cup of tea Henderson offered. The heat from the teacup seeped through the thin ceramic layer, warming his cold fingers. Henderson was silent for a long time, his eyes as if looking somewhere far away. "About all the years I sat on the bench, about all the judgments I made, about the prejudices I didn't even realize I had." He turned to look at the photos on the wall, My daughter. She's a social activist. She always talked to me about white privilege, about systemic racism. I thought she was too extreme, too childish to understand the real world. How does the economy work? Henderson smiled bitterly. It turns out I'm the one who doesn't understand. Marcus took a sip of tea, letting the bitter taste spread in his mouth. Recognizing the problem is the first step, Your Excellency. But it's not enough, is it? Henderson turned back to look at Marcus. I have spent my life serving justice, at least as I understand it. But now, looking back at the numbers in the report, I wonder, how many lives were affected by my prejudice? How many people did not receive real justice in my courtroom? The sound of the rain outside had gotten heavier, tapping steadily on the roof like a sad song. In the warm, yellow light of the room, Marcus could see tears glistening in the corners of Henderson's eyes. I didn't come here to accuse you, Marcus said softly. I came here because I believe change is possible. Henderson wiped his tears with the sleeve of his sweater. You know, Mr. Johnson, during my 40 years in the legal profession, I have prided myself on my ability to judge people. I think I can see through a person just by the way they stand, the way they speak. But now I realize, all I see is what I want to see, what my prejudices allow me to see. Marcus put down the teacup. The light sound of porcelain hitting the wooden surface echoed in the quiet space. We all have prejudices, Your Excellency. What matters is what we do when we recognize them. That's why I wanted to see you, Henderson said, standing up and walking over to a bookshelf. He took down a thick file. This is a list of all the cases I have tried in the past 3 years. I want you to help me review them. Not as a prosecutor, but as a fighter for justice. Marcus took the file, feeling its weight, not just the physical weight of the papers, but the weight of the lives affected by its decisions. It's going to take a lot of time, Marcus said. I know, Henderson nodded, but this is the little I can do to correct my mistakes. And maybe from these mistakes we can learn something. Maybe help the judges others don't make the same mistakes. Marcus stood up, holding the file in his hand. Through the window, he could see that the rain had stopped, leaving sparkling drops of water on the leaves. The sunset filtered through the breaking clouds, creating a faint rainbow across the Houston sky. You know, Marcus said, when I walked into your courtroom that day, I was angry. Not just because of the way you treated me, but because I had seen so much of Henderson in my career. But now, I realize, maybe what we need is not more anger, but more understanding and courage to admit mistakes. Henderson nodded, his old eyes shining with a glimmer of hope. Justice is not just about punishing wrong people, it's also about righting wrongs. Isn't that right, Mr. Johnson? That's right, Marcus smiled. And sometimes, the first step to righting a wrong is realizing that we all have the ability to change. When Marcus left the Henderson house, dusk had given way to darkness. The first stars began to twinkle in the Houston sky, like bright spots of hope in the darkness. He knows that the fight for justice is still long, but every step forward, no matter how small, is a precious victory. In the car, he played Nina Simone again. This time, the melody is no longer filled with sadness as before, but is full of hope for a better future. A future where justice is truly colorblind, where each person is judged by the content of his soul, not their skin color. I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. Nina Simone's voice echoed in the car space, and Marcus knew that every day, every small action, we are getting closer to that freedom.